While little recognized in the United States today, in the early 1900s, a Basque sport that had been played for centuries seemed poised to enter the American mainstream. Babe Ruth was a fan and sometimes player. Ernest Hemingway called it a grand sport. Eleanor Roosevelt was photographed taking in a game, and it interested stars like Carol Flynn and John Travolta. The brief and now little remembered American craze for Jai Alai is history that deserves to be remembered.
Handball games have been played since ancient times, and versions of them have evolved into some modern sports like tennis and, of course, handball. In the Basque region of Spain and France, the Basques developed their own versions of the game called Basque pelota. The original handball games were played with players facing each other across a net, but in the Basque regions of Spain and France, the game changed. Soon players played facing a wall, using their hands to fling the ball against the wall and back. The court handball games of the Basque were popular with royalty. Henry VII gave a gift of 100 English pounds to the champion Basque pelota player. Don Quixote, in the famous novel, witnessed devils playing pelota, holding bats of fire and using books instead of balls. It has become an important cultural game for the Basques, an ancient and in many ways still enigmatic ethnic group. A popular Basque song, according to Paula Morton, author of Jai Alai, A Cultural History of the Fastest Game in the World, goes, "Learn, children, to speak Basque, play pelota, and dance correctly." From the early days, it was a popular game played on market days and at festivals. In addition to watching and celebrating, audience members often made bets. By the late 1700s, the game was becoming entrenched in Basque country, with some of the earliest courts, called frontons, dating to the 1780s. The game slowly evolved into multiple types, one using hands or gloves to hit the ball, another using a flat wooden paddle or bat, and another using a narrow curved scoop, eventually called a cesta, which could catch and fling the ball at incredible speeds. When rubber came from America, the Basques soon used it to make the ball, which is smaller than a baseball but larger than a golf ball, with a goat skin covering. The goal is to fling the ball at the wall in such a way that the opponent cannot return it, earning a point. The game is played on a three-walled court, with the right side open for spectators. The version with the cesta is the game that would eventually become known as Jai Alai. The exact origin is, however, unclear. One origin story claims a potato farmer in Basque France was scooping potatoes with a deep curved shovel, which gave him the idea of making the light wicker cesta. A different story has a young Basque boy using his mother's flower basket as a glove, although the details in the story change depending on who is telling it. Whatever the origin, it became popular around the mid-19th century in the Basque region. The sport traveled with the Basques, as Basque scholar Carmelo Urzo said. Wherever they went, they took their customs and traditions with them, as well as their religion and beloved pelota. It went especially to the Basque diaspora centers in places like Havana, Buenos Aires, Manila, and Miami, Florida. By the early 20th century, it began supplanting most earlier versions of Basque ball outside of the Basque homeland. Fast-paced, part aerobic exercise and part strength, the balls can be flung as fast as 200 miles an hour. Promoters dubbed it the fastest game in the world. The Spanish port of Marquina, where a fronton was built in the 1700s, would become known as the University of Jai Alai, thanks to the numerous players who trained there. In 1875, Serafin Baroja coined the term Jai Alai, which means merry festival in the Basque language, to describe the version of the game that now resembles the modern version. In 1928, the court in Marquina was enlarged specifically to play Cesta Punta, already called Jai Alai internationally. The game became popular in South America. In 1891, the Liverpool Mercury reported on the fronton of Buenos Aires, where the Basque game of pelota is played. A report in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch from 1893 said pelota was exceptionally popular in South America. In 1896, the Buffalo Commercial reported on frontons in Mexico City, where basketball players entertained thousands of people weekly, and that one fronton cleared in a year $100,000 net. The modern cesta was perfected not in Spain or the Basque Country, but in Argentina, where a large number of Basques had immigrated during the crises in the 19th century. A player named Melchor Gorosiaga designed the roughly 2.5-foot-long basket after he fractured his wrist in 1887 and failed to gain enough strength to use the shorter chistera. This change brought greater speed, allowing the rubber balls to fly like a bullet from a rifle. Fans dubbed the new tool the Mauser after the German rifle. It could be dangerous. The first recorded death came in 1907 when a player was hit in the temple with a ball. His skull was fractured and he died after an attempted surgery. It was from Cuba that Jai Alai would make its way to America. Versions of the Basque pelota were present in Cuba for a century, since at least 1790, when a Havana newspaper advertised 9 accomplished Basque players compete in a great game of ball. Cuba had already developed a culture of betting, which only amplified the already present subculture surrounding pelota. Journalist Henry Harrison Lewis wrote that in a game lasting no more than 8 minutes, as high as $20,000 changed hands. General Leonard Wood, a Rough Rider and the military governor of Cuba after the Spanish-American War, became a convert. In 1901, a writer for the Atlanta Constitution wrote of the new sensation of pelota and reported that Wood has become an enthusiastic player. Wood's association with Jai Alai would become front-page news when he lobbied for the construction of a new fronton in Havana and accepted gifts from the company that built it in return. It was a major sticking point in the debate over his promotion to Major General in 1903, both because of the alleged corruption and because Jai Alai was an immoral gambling concern. Jai Alai first appeared in the United States in 1901 when a fronton was built in San Francisco at a cost of $35,000, where it was hoped that it would become popular on account of the unusual skill required to play. By December of that year, games were being played 4 times a week. What success it had seems to have been brief, however, and reports of the game fell out of the papers. It was reported that a Havana syndicate planned on building a fronton near Central Park in New York City, but nothing came of it. A bigger attempt to popularize the game was made in 1904, when a fronton was built just outside the St. Louis World's Fair by a company of Cubans. The fronton was designed by Ricardo Galbraith, the same man who had designed the fronton in Havana. A 1904 article in the St. Louis Republic explained that the fronton was to be permanent and commercial, and Jai Alai's primary means of making money was betting. The hope was that it would provide another legal betting option in the United States. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch called Jai Alai the greatest gambling game in the world and the most exciting. The first game was played on Sunday, May 15th, and hawkers passed out flyers to fairgoers, claiming Jai Alai was the most interesting, scientific, exciting, greatest ball game in the world. There was a problem, however. Gambling was banned in Missouri, and without it, spectators seemed to struggle to get into the foreign sport, played by foreigners whose names that were difficult for Americans to pronounce. Shortly after it opened, it closed, and the company was dissolved. The Jai Alai building remained, renamed the Winter Garden, and converted into a roller skating rink and an ice skating rink before it was finally demolished in 1964. But the sport remained popular in Cuba. First daughter Alice Roosevelt Longworth was said to follow the sport on her trip there, and Babe Ruth came to enjoy the sport when he visited Cuba to play baseball. Ernest Hemingway tapped a Jai Alai player in his scheme to damage a German U-boat off of Cuba during the Second World War. The plan was to have a laden fishing boat lure a hungry U-boat captain and then to attack. The Jai Alai player's job was to toss a grenade in an open hatch. Across the United States, communities of Basque played the game in informal settings and makeshift frontons, like the Enduiza fronton in the basement of a Basque hotel in Boise, Idaho. They usually played just with their hands, unable to fabricate the specialized cesta. It wouldn't be until the 1920s that Jai Alai had the opportunity to sink its teeth into the American consciousness, and it did so in Florida. In the 20s, millions of acres of land was drained of Florida swamps, igniting a land boom. In 1924, Cuban investors constructed a plain fronton in Hialeah Park, near where greyhounds and horses raced. They dubbed it Biscayne Jai Alai, and it was later called Miami Jai Alai. The players were taken largely from Cuba and were, of course, often of Basque ancestry. Gambling was illegal in Florida, but went on anyway in various forms, especially under the idea that betting was different than gambling if there were no organized bookmakers. Another version that skirted laws was to place a bet by buying postcards of racehorses, and if the horse won, the postcard could be returned for winnings. Similar systems worked with Jai Alai. In 1926, the original fronton was destroyed in the Big Blow, or the Great Miami Hurricane, and a new one was built near the present Miami airport. Hoping to make the game profitable, the Fronton Exhibition Company brought in a new general manager, Bostonian Richard R. Berenson. Berenson would be successful in shaking up the business. The beautiful fronton will be a blaze of lights when it opens, the Miami Daily News reported in 1929. A glassed nightclub was added on the 5th floor. Berenson brought the best players who engaged in their nightclub duels with the cesta and bullet-like ball, encouraging fast action. But still, no gambling. Gambling in Florida was hotly contested. Governor Doyle Carleton crusaded against it, targeting Jai Alai, greyhound racing, and in particular Al Capone. A series of events was pressuring the state, however. Hurricanes like the Big Blow and the 1928 Okeechobee hurricane helped end the Florida land boom. The 1929 citrus crop was devastated by the Mediterranean fruit fly. The stock market crashed, inaugurating the Great Depression. Legalized gambling would bring in needed tax revenue. Carleton vetoed a bill to legalize pari-mutuel or pool betting, but it was passed over his veto on June 5, 1931. In pari-mutuel betting, all bets are put into a single pool, which then has the house stake removed. The remaining pool is then split among winning bets. This differentiates from fixed odds betting because the payout isn't calculated until after the pool is established. Getting Jai Alai on an approved list of gambling sports was the trick. An attempt to get Jai Alai off the ground in Chicago in 1927 failed when gambling on the sport was denied, while in Shanghai, China, a fronton flourished with legal betting, at least until Mao Zedong took over. Berenson finally succeeded in convincing Florida legislatures to let people bet on Jai Alai in 1935. Jai Alai was a hit in Florida, though it had a mixed success elsewhere. It was dangerous and required high levels of athleticism. Pancho Villa called it a man's game. A fronton in New Orleans lasted at least 13 years, so in 1938 it seemed logical to bring Jai Alai to New York. Berenson brought out the big guns. One player remembered it was the first time they were going to have radio coverage from coast to coast. There were 300 writers from all over the world to cover it. Americans are becoming more enthused about the sport, said the New York Sun. They're even learning Spanish cheers and curses. But the interest waned, especially when the New York Gaming Commission refused to make it a gambling sport. It closed in the spring of 1939. But in Miami, the sport flourished. Jai Alai players became celebrities. In the middle of the century, Jai Alai grew in popularity, expanding to 10 frontons in the 1970s. It spread elsewhere as well and was played at the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas. In the 1970s, pari-mutuel betting on Jai Alai was legalized in Connecticut and Rhode Island. It was a time when professional players, predominantly Basque, could play Jai Alai internationally, traveling from fronton to fronton. In 1967, players in Florida began wearing helmets, thanks to a near death during a game in Spain. In 1961, a police radar gun was used to measure a ball flung by a player, which was tracked at 188 miles an hour. The sport's main problems were persistent issues of betting scandals and criminal associations. In 1977, 3 players were charged with a conspiracy to rig games. In 1980, 6 players and 5 bettors were convicted of game fixing. In 1974, the Daytona Beach fronton burned down, with mob boss Salvatore Carfori implicated in the arson. The Palm Beach fronton burned down in a similar but unsolved act of arson 4 years later. In 1979, Geraldo Rivera did a segment about corruption in Jai Alai. He suggested the Palm Beach fire may have been related to insurance fraud or other corruption. In 1981, John the Executioner Martirano, with ties to James Whitey Bulger, killed World Jai Alai owner Roger Wheeler in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Wheeler had a fortune and was involved in many industries, but it brought bad press to Jai Alai and organized crime's connections to it. The previous president of World Jai Alai was found shot in the back of the head in his car's trunk a year later. Wheeler seems to have discovered that money was being skimmed off and was planning to stop it. In 1986, the sport was featured nationally on an episode of Miami Vice, a mixed blessing that brought attention to the sport while alluding to some of its more unsavory connections. But the thing that would be most devastating to the sport began in 1988, when players, largely Basque, began the longest strike in U.S. professional sport history. The strike was over benefits. Picket lines formed, and managers turned to what players they could find, from those willing to cross the line to amateurs. The quality of play plummeted, as did the audience. The strike ended after 3 years in 1991, and by then things had changed. Betting, so integral to its success, had new competition in the form of Native American casinos and legal lotteries, which offered faster-paced betting. The audience simply never returned. By 1996, only one fronton was left in Connecticut, and the last game was played in the state in 2001. The MGM fronton burned down in 1980 and wasn't rebuilt. Across the 90s, frontons in Florida and in Mexico closed. By 2008, only 6 frontons remained, and only 2 played year-round. In Cuba, where its popularity had first exploded, the sport was banned in 1962 by Fidel Castro.
Despite its brief moment, Jai Alai never quite managed to enter the mainstream and stuck on the periphery of American sport, although there certainly was a craze for a while, at least in some places. Today it's really only played in Florida, and even there, one of the last of the frontons at Magic City Casino is due to close this year. But there are organizations like the World Jai Alai Organization that are still looking to popularize the sport, which is still popular, of course, in Basque Country, where the sport was invented and from which most of its great players have originated. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.